That Professor Levy and I know you. Just double check with us that we've checked you down as asking a question. And we're waiting to go online. Okay. Who's in charge of Metro was the other question I was going to ask.
You're all here.
We're glad to have you.
The whole organization.
Yes. We're very glad you're here. Well, good afternoon and welcome to our Center for Transportation Studies Friday Transportation Seminar. And very pleased to introduce Professor David Levinson from the University of Minnesota. He's here as part of the OTREC Visiting Scholar Program. And Dave is going to be speaking about transport, land use, and value. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Rob. And thank you for inviting me. This is work that was done as part of several projects funded by a number of agencies, Minnesota Department of Transportation, National Science Foundation, and the UK Economic Social Research Council. And it was done with several colleagues. Ahmed El-Ghanady, who was a PhD here and then became a postdoc at Minnesota and is now at McGill University. Feng Zhi, who's working at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and two graduate students, Shanjiang Zhu, Michael Iacano, and Jerry Zhao, who's a faculty member in the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. So I'm going to begin by showing you growth in the Twin Cities region. Minneapolis is to your left, St. Paul is to your right, and you can see the growth, the increase in residential area as time progresses from the 1950s through 2005. And that map is replicated in cities across the United States and across the world. And why are these cities growing? Well, these cities are growing because we've created additional transportation resources and accessibility that allows people to reach land use activities from different places more easily. So over the period from 1958 to 2005, the interstate highway system was deployed, and that's probably the most notable change in the Twin Cities region for explaining how accessibility changed. But lots of other changes took place. So we think of this formula, access is the product of land use and transport. And we can say it a little bit more formally, accessibility at point I is the sum of all of the opportunities at various points J multiplied by some terms for interaction between points I and J. And so we say the cost of I and J, for instance, the travel time between I and J. And the higher the travel time, the more expensive interaction is. The lower the travel time, the closer those opportunities are. And so we have a function which allows us to weight these opportunities by the distance of the travel time. And these opportunities can be various things. We think of them as jobs. We think of them as stores. And the points are any type of location, but for the purpose of transportation analysis, we might be using traffic analysis zones as measures. But we can use any geography we want. And we can make this simple. We can make this complicated. We can look at which opportunities, mention jobs, we mentioned shopping, airport, other types of opportunities are important to people. Amenities are opportunities that are important to people. I want to be near parks. I want to be near recreational facilities. In the Twin Cities, you want to be near the lakes. You might want to have a good view, so you have access to a view. You can think about which cost. If you're driving, travel time by car is important. If you're walking, travel time by foot is important. If you're riding a bike, travel time by biking is important. If you're taking transit, travel time by transit is important. There's a lot of different costs that you might think of. Travel time is the most important, but there's monetary costs as well if you have to pay for parking, if you have to pay tolls, if you have to pay transit fares. Those all can get added into the equation. And then there's the question of which function do you use? And there's a lot of different functions that would relate travel time and opportunities to accessibility. But we don't need to decide this arbitrarily. Okay? These relationships are determined by the market. And we can argue that the only place that people locate anywhere in particular is A, because we want to possess resources. So we locate where there's a mine because we want to extract gold or coal or something from the ground. We locate in a particular area because we're going to be planting a particular crop, and so the agriculture is good there. Or we want to be near something, so I want to be near jobs, I want to be near stores. Or we want to be far from something. I don't like my neighbors. I want as much land as possible to separate me from my neighbors. And so accessibility is a function of these proximity variables. We don't own mines, especially in urban areas. So this is the proximity between where I am and everything that I want to reach or everything that I don't want to reach. And that's how we're measuring this. And this access creates value. And we don't have to decide this arbitrarily. That is measured in the price of land. And there's a whole class of models called Hedonic Models, which look at what is the price, or what is the price per square meter of a parcel or of a structure, and that's a function of a set of attributes. And accessibility is one of those attributes. The quality of the structure is another attribute. The quantity of the structure, how big it is, how many bathrooms does it have, how many square feet of office space is there, does it have a fireplace? All of those attributes of the structure are important in determining the price of land. And so we can decompose the price into these quantities, and we can figure out how much the accessibility is worth. And we can also look at the structure itself, and that structure is a function of the price. We build good homes in places that have good accessibility. We generally don't build good homes in places with poor accessibility because we're investing in something that's not going to have as good a rate of return. So using hedonic models, research has indicated the Twin Cities region, for instance, we have a measure of accessibility which says how many jobs are there within 20 minutes. Okay, the more jobs within 20 minutes, the more job accessibility there is. And in this case, it's 20 minutes by driving. And we found that each additional job adds 25 cents to the price of a house, which isn't a lot, except we're dealing with 100,000 jobs, so that would be adding $25,000 to the price of a house. And so looking at our accessibility model, an opportunity at point J is an additional job, and our function is a very simple function here, within 20 minutes. Okay, you can look at other amenities. Okay, jobs is one thing that you want to reach, but you could look at access to parks, and we've priced that. We can look at access to shops, and that's important. We can look at access by different modes and see how much people will weight the accessibility by different modes. Being able to get places by highway is important if most people are driving. Being able to get places by transit is important if most people are taking transit. So we can think about a model. The beginning of the model is relating transport and land use. So in the upper left corner there, you see transit demand. And the more transit demand you have, the more buses that you can run, the more streetcars that you can run, the more transit capacity there'll be, because the additional riders will generate revenue that can be invested in providing additional capacity. The more capacity that there is, the more accessibility there is, because the more things I can reach in a given amount of time. If I'm running 2 buses an hour, I'm running a bus every 30 minutes, the amount of time that I have to spend waiting is halved, and therefore I'm able to reach more things in the same amount of time because I don't have to wait as long. The more accessibility there is, the more transit demand there'll be, because the more things that I can reach, not only will there be changes in land use, there'll be changes in behavior given the orientation of land use. We can see a similar relationship on the highway side, and that doesn't come through quite as clearly, but you can see we have auto demand, we have road capacity, and we have auto accessibility. And we similarly have a positive feedback loop there. Okay? The more auto demand there is, the more money there'll be to build roads. The more roads there'll be, the shorter distance that I'll have to travel in order to get from point A to point B, and therefore the faster I can go from point A to point B, creating more accessibility. And the more accessibility there is, the more highway demand there'll be. Now, on the highway side, and on the transit side to a lesser extent, but especially on the highway side, we see congestion. And so the more congestion there is, the less accessibility I have because I'm slowing down the roads. Okay, so the more additional traffic slows down the roads. Now, additional passengers on the transit side will slow down buses because it'll take longer to board and alight the buses, but the phenomenon isn't generally as strong or as pertinent. And the more road capacity I build, on the other hand, the less congestion that I have. Now, we can talk about degrees and how effective in each individual investment is, but if I expand the facility, I should have less congestion, all other things being equal. Now, in this system, there's, of course, cross-feedbacks between the two modes. The more road capacity I build, the less transit demand there'll be, because if the road capacity is better, more people will be attracted to that mode. And similarly, the more transit capacity there is, the less auto demand there'll be. Now, these things will affect land price and ultimately development. Okay, so I have a relationship. The more transit accessibility there is and the more highway accessibility there is, the more valuable a particular parcel is. So the more densely that parcel will be developed. And so you have a positive feedback loop between transit accessibility and highway accessibility and land development. And the more development there is, the more people there are, and therefore the higher the demand will be. And so the more development you have, the higher the transit demand, and similarly the higher the auto demand. Now, this is a model of how the land use and transport system interact without sort of any mention of of government or money yet, but we can introduce value capture mechanisms, and these can either be public value capture mechanisms or private value capture mechanisms. And I'll start in the present, again, to the empirical part of the presentation. We'll talk about the private side using value capture, but there's also opportunities for the public side to use value capture. And so if we have more development, there's a lot of resources there. There's additional value. And that value can be used to fund transportation infrastructure. Okay, so there's a positive linkage between land development and value captured. But of course, the higher the taxes that you put on development, there'll be less new development there. So if we're using that value capture mechanism, we might be discouraging development because not all of the profits will be able to be captured by the development itself. Some of that will be captured by a public agency, for instance. And so there's a negative feedback loop between value capture and the amount of development. But if we capture that value and then we invest it in either transit or highways, we're going to be increasing transit capacity or highway capacity. So this is the general model. Okay. We finally have perhaps some relationships between congestion and value capture, but not think about that at the moment. So this is a series of positive and negative feedback loops. But the main opportunities here are in the capturing and harnessing the positive feedback loops. You can argue that cities are positive feedback loops in space. Okay? They're a manifestation of that. Okay. Anyone want to name the city? Vancouver. This? Yes, Vancouver, BC. Okay, upper right, Paris and Tokyo. Okay, and these are realizations of that positive feedback process. Someone says this is a good place for activities to occur because they have a good natural harbor in the case of Vancouver or Tokyo, because there's other, it's a good defense location in the case of the Paris of old, and it became the center of government. And so that seed leads to investments, and those investments create accessibility to things that are important. Okay, in the case of Tokyo, the ability to trade, as well as the access to the national capital. In Vancouver, trade. In Paris, defense, as well as trade. And that additional development leads to more investments in more transportation facilities. In the case of France, all of the roads in France are oriented towards Paris, so it has good intercity connections. In the case of Tokyo and Vancouver, they've got good international connections. And that leads to more development. So you're taking this seed and you're running this process through. And because it's attracting more development than other areas that are nearby, it's where all of the tall buildings get built, essentially. It's where the city is centered. And transport and land use are interdependent shapers of urban form. And we're going to look at part of that feedback loop in the empirical analysis. We're going to talk about the transit demand, transit accessibility, transit capacity, value capture, and land price and development. And the first example is going to be based in London, where I spent sabbatical. And this was funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council. And so London, this is great, basically, I want to say Greater London because that's an old name for the administrative area, but it's more than just the center city of London that you're all familiar with. Everyone will be familiar with the areas that are denoted by 7 and 33. Area 33 is where the Houses of Parliament are. That's Westminster. 7 is the City of London, which is the old City of London where the financial district is, where the riots were yesterday, the center, financial capital of the world, and where the city grew up. And the city grew around those points. And the blue line through the middle is the River Thames. And each of these boroughs is useful because in our analysis we'll be looking at how population changed by borough and how transportation capacity changed by borough. And in London, the census has been in England. The census has been collected every 10 years approximately since 1801, and it's all been geocoded back to the borough level. And so we can look at the evolution of population density. The dark areas have a higher population density. And the lines are the introduction of surface rail lines, and the colored lines are the introduction of the underground system, which is not entirely underground. Over the period from, we started in 1801, we're now in the early 1900s, And you can see how the system is growing and changing, and the land use is changing. And what we want to be able to do is to disentangle this map, to see if there's cause and effect going on here. Is the land use leading the infrastructure construction? Is the infrastructure construction leading to changes in development? And so to give you a sense of population density, okay, this color, sorry, it doesn't come out, but that's on the order of 50,000 people per square kilometer. So in the center of City of London, the center square there, in 1801 to 1850 had a population density of 50,000 people per square kilometer, which is the densest place on Earth at the time and probably still. And we'll see this, over the period of time we see a significant suburbanization that was accompanied by the construction of the rail lines. So rail first came into London in 1836. The first steam railway had been invented in 1825, the Stockton and Darlington in northern England, and a number of lines were built in the period between the late 1820s and the early 1830s, moving into the City of London. And so by 1846, there were lines coming from all directions, approaching the City of London, basically pointed like a gun at the city center, but not yet crossing into the city center because there was a considerable concern about being able to puncture that city center with surface railway lines. And a Royal Commission was set up, a Royal Commission on Railway Termini. So where should all the stations be? Okay, should there be a single Union station? Should all the rail lines come together at a single point? Or should there be multiple termini? And the Commission suggested there be what became known as the Metropolitan Railway, which would connect the termini as an underground rail line. And so on the northern side of London, there are about 5 different rail stations. So if you want to go to Scotland, you get on one. If you want to you're going to the western areas, you go to Paddington Station. Depending on where you're going, you go to a different railway station. These aren't that far apart. London isn't that large a place, but it's large enough that you want to be able to have some convenient connection. So a Metropolitan Railway was chartered to connect all of these stations. And it took 9 years between chartering and opening, but in 1863, the first subway in the world opened, steam railway underground. So the steam was being pumped into a tunnel, so you can imagine the breathing conditions. It was phenomenally successful. And after this opened, and as it was about to be opened, a number of other railways were chartered. And by 1884, the Circle Line was completed. So the southern termini in London were connected, and those were connected up to the northern termini. And as you imagine, we have this first layer of subways underground, all built with a cut and cover method. So basically, a street was trenched, a railway was put in, a roof was built over the railway, and the street was put back in place. And that's all well and good, except if you want to cross that, you can't do that with the same technique because you already have a railway there, and you don't want the railways crossing underground at the same elevation. So you need a deeper tunneling technology, and that wasn't invented until the late 1880s. And by 1890, the City and South London Railway, which is the first deep tube line, was built. If you've been to London, you'll notice that the deep tube lines are much smaller, much more claustrophobic than the first generation of subway lines, which are basically railway cars just underground. These are much narrower. Now, it's important to note that in general, railways were not permitted to be land developers, but there was one important exception, and that was the Metropolitan Railway, which was the first one, which was permitted to be a developer. And it developed most of the northwest suburbs, much of the northwest suburbs of London, an area that came to be referred to as Metroland. The other railways were not permitted to be developers, but that did not mean developers could not own railways, and that did not mean that members of the boards of railways and directors of railways could not also be members of or directors of development companies. And so there's a lot of other interlinkages between railways and development. So the railways continued to be expanded. You saw the great period of expansion from 1860s to the 1920s. After World War II, a greenbelt was established around London, and no more rail lines were built connecting the center of London to the outside, although about every 10 years a new underground line has continued to open. Surface railway construction ended in the 1920s, and there hasn't been any significant construction since then. So what's going on? Now, the City of London, as I mentioned, is the 1 mile square area in the center, and that had a population density of about 50,000 people per square kilometer. And that population density lasted until the 1850s, and the first railways were introduced in 1836, And we see that density beginning to drop steadily over time. In contrast, while the residential density dropped, the employment density took off. Okay, so London's growing from a city of 50,000, 100,000 people in 1801 to a city of 8 million today. This is not just the city center of London, which is the City of London, but this population density is through all of Greater London. And that population density changes in what we call the core boroughs and the peripheral boroughs. And the core here is blue is the City of London and basically the surrounding boroughs. And the density there continues to rise until the 1880s before it begins to drop. So you can think from the 1830s to the 1880s, people are moving out from the City of London proper to the surrounding boroughs as places to live, as the City of London becomes a major employment center. And the railways continue to be built out from this core to the peripheral areas, and the population density in those areas basically rises continuously up to the 1950s when London reaches roughly its current population. And after the 1880s, even the core boroughs outside of the city begin to depopulate because the people who had moved there in the 1830s eventually moved to the farther suburbs later on. And we can similarly see what's happening with the number of stations. And this is stations per kilometer squared. So how dense is the network of stations? And so the first line is the surface railway station in the peripheral boroughs, surface rail station density in the core boroughs, underground density in the peripheral is the purple line, and then finally the red line, underground station density in the core. And so we have about 2 stations per square kilometer, which is at the very center of the city, which is, for underground stations, very high capacity lines, extremely high density. So you didn't have to walk very far. In some places, stations are 100 meters apart or less than that. And so you walk out of one station to the other. If they were closer than that, they might even have shared the same station between different lines. And so this is looking at the correlation between, for the 33 boroughs of London, what is the correlation between rail station density rank and population density rank? So if there's a perfect correlation, we'd expect to see a 1, meaning that the most dense borough in terms of population would also be the most dense in terms of the number of stations. And we see from the 1840s up till the 1860s, the correlation begins to rise, getting to a very high level of about 0.9, meaning there's a very good correlation or association between these two. And that lasts until the 1920s, and then we begin to see the correlation drop steadily over time. Now, this is for surface rails, and we see initially there's a very good fit, but over time there's an increasing misfit. And we can look at underground stations similarly, and those are built from the center out, and the first lines opened in 1863, so the first census which included those lines was the 1871 census, and the correlation is about 0.8. And that drops steadily over time down to 0.4 if we exclude the City of London, and to about 0.5 or 0.6 if we exclude the City of London. And again, what's going on? We're depopulating the center as people move out. The fixed infrastructure stays, and people are mobile. Okay, so once we build a rail station, we're not likely to move that rail station. We can take it out. We can try to build new lines, but once we've basically completed the network, we can't move the rail network very much, but people are still very mobile. There's other modes competing. So in the 1910s, we see the introduction of the motor bus. And so we have surface motorized buses that begin to compete with the underground railways. Of course, the railways competed with the horse-drawn buses. We also see the introduction of electric streetcars in the late 1890s and the early 1900s. Which largely got replaced by motor buses in the 1920s through the 1950s. And then the widespread adoption of the automobile, especially in the outer areas of London, beginning in the 1920s, but really taking off in the post-war period. So we have a process of the network connections to the suburbs are depopulating the core. So we can look at the population density rank of the City of London. It was the most dense borough, so it's ranked 1 up through 1870. But then it begins to slip as time goes on. It's depopulating. Now, this correlates pretty well with the number of boroughs that have underground stations, the number of places that will allow you to connect to the center city. So this leads us to our hypothesis that there's really three processes going on here. In developed areas, we can either have transportation following land use or transportation leading land use. And both of those things are going on. First, on the right-hand side, you can see constructing a new higher speed mode in an existing area will be in a case of transportation following land use. So this happens. We have a City of London before we have an underground system. But then we build the underground system, and development becomes much denser. Okay? In the case of the City of London, the residential density becomes much lower, but the employment density becomes much higher and more than compensates for that. And finally, we have process C, which can take place in an undeveloped area where we're constructing a new line where there is very little or no development, and that is spurring additional development. So basically developing greenfields. And we look at this a little bit more formally. We're trying to predict the density, either the population density on the one hand or the underground density on the other hand, of an area at a given time. So what we have is a panel set of data. Okay, so we have a series of observations for each of the 33 boroughs every 10 years. And we have this, in principle, we have this data from 1801 to 2001. In practice, the years before the railway aren't terribly interesting. So we go from 1841 to the present for surface railways and 1871 to the present for the underground railways. But we want to look at what's going on in neighboring boroughs. Okay, so what's going on in a particular borough depends on what's going on next door. There's a set of variables that change with time and area, a set of variables that change with the area but not time, and a set of variables that change with time but not the area. There's a number of modeling issues with this. Okay, we talked about the core and the periphery. How do we define the core and the periphery? The definitions that are used here are based on the ratio of employment to residences. So if there are more people working in an area than workers who live in an area, in the current day, we're defining that as the core, which is basically the set of boroughs, including the City of London and immediately surrounding it, and the other areas of the periphery. And there's only one borough which has more employees than residents that is not in the core, and that's around Heathrow Airport, which is a special case, which we won't be thinking about. Question of the time period I mentioned, looking at 1841 to 2001 for the surface railways, deal with a 10-year lag structure because that's what the census comes in, test linear models as well as some log transformations. When we're thinking about the question of what neighbors to look at and talking about statistical issues referred to as spatial autocorrelation, it was very tricky because there's not a well-defined methodology for how do you look at the relationship between points on a network. Okay, and there's a lot of possible relationships between areas. Here we're defining the neighbor as the borough that is nearest London. So if the City of London. So if this is the city, and this is the borough of interest, then this is the neighbor that we're going to look at because it's the neighbor that is nearest the City of London for a particular borough. And then we model this with an ordinary least squares regression, correcting for standard errors, panel-corrected standard errors. And so basically, the first thing that we're looking at is what it predicts the population density in a given borough. Okay? And so there's a number of variables, the most important of which is what was the population density 10 years ago. So if there were 100,000 people in a borough 10 years ago, most of the residences of those 100,000 people are still going to be there. So roughly the same number of people will be there. It might have grown some, it might have shrunk some, but we'll be working off of that base. And so we expect that to be positive and significant, and it turns out to be so. But then the question is, what's happening 20 years ago? Now, 20 years ago might tell you something about trends over time. Is there an acceleration or a deceleration? And it's not clear from theory what that should necessarily be, but it turns out to be negative and significant, which means there's a dampening. So if there's a fast growth period 20 years ago, then it's likely to slow down. If it was a slow growth period 20 years ago, it's likely to be a little bit faster. Or if there's a depopulation 20 years ago, it's likely to switch signs. If the regional population is increasing, we expect the population to increase. But the questions at hand are, what is the relationship of transportation to population density? And so we can see surface rail density. If between 20 years ago and 10 years ago there was an increase in the number of surface rail stations, then this period is going to see more people living in that particular borough than were there 10 years ago. So it's positive and significant. Similarly with underground density. And we can look at the neighbor effects, and the neighbor effects are fairly similar, although there's one odd sign in the results in terms of the neighbor underground density. And other descriptive variables like how far the borough is to London, or whether it's north or south of the river, or even the constant term, turn out to be not significant. So this is looking at the peripheral boroughs, and where we expect to see suburbanization. In the core boroughs, we see increase in employment density, but we don't have employment statistics outside of the city of London for a historical period. So we're just looking at the residential density there. And so if the residential density in the core is going to have the opposite effect in the periphery if we expect to see a decentralization of the population. And that's what shows up with these results. And you can look at them. The numbers are in the paper, which is online. I'll have a link at the end. But you see a similar pattern if it's proportional to what the population density is 10 years ago. But building rail lines doesn't increase the population density in the core boroughs. So one of the questions was looking at how's the population density affected by the construction of infrastructure. The other question is, how is the infrastructure affected by the change in population? Is the infrastructure following the land use? So again, we look at the periphery. And so if there were a lot of stations 10 years ago, then most of the stations will still be there. We're not tearing up stations with abandon. There are occasional removals of stations, but there's not too many of those. And if there's more stations being built system-wide, we expect more to be in a particular borough. But the increase in population density is positively related to the increase in surface rail station density in the periphery, and it's negatively related to the surface rail station in the core. And we can look at the same thing with underground density. The underground density, the number of underground stations per square kilometer, and we see a positive relationship there. So in the periphery, changes in population are attracting underground stations. So we want to look at elasticities. Okay, there's a lot of numbers in this, and we want to be able to reduce this. So what is a 1% change in rail density due to the population density? Well, it turns out a 1% increase in the rail density in this period increases population density by about 0.23%. And similarly, a 1% change in population density increases rail density by about 0.23%. And that's coincidence. I mean, there's no necessity that these numbers be exactly the same, much less even close to each other. But it shows you that there's this relationship in both directions. And this is a change in population density from 20 to 10 years ago on the density today. So we're looking at a clear lagged effect here. There's no overlapping time periods here. And similarly, a change in population density, 1% change in population density will increase the underground density by about 0.27%. And in the core, all of the signs are negative on population density. Now, if we had employment density, all of the signs would probably be positive. But we can look at the decrease in residential density as being associated with the positive increase in employment density. And the magnitudes are similar, but the effects are a bit stronger in the core. Of course, it's a smaller area and denser, so we expect it to be a little bit stronger. So the qualitative model says that what happened in London was first intercity rail connected from the outside to the edges of the city of London. So we have an outside-in process. And then the underground system first connected those stations and then became an inside-out process. And that led to the development of new suburbs, a decentralizing effect for residences, and lowering of the population density in the center while the whole regional population was increasing. And there were a number of other factors that one can talk about, but these are the major factors. And there's these other qualitative factors that people have talked about historically, the role of entrepreneurs, the difference between the north side of the river and the south side of the river, different geology on the north side and the south side. Tunneling is easier on the north side than on the south side because the south side's a bit swampier. That led to changes in differences that beyond what could be explained by the model, but the model explains a lot. So in London, can argue that rail causes, and this is using causation in the terms of Granger causation, that it precedes and is positively and statistically related to suburban density. So we have induced demand. And that development Granger causes rail infrastructure so that there's induced supply. Okay, so there's a positive feedback system. If we have both induced demand and induced supply, there's a positive feedback system. And this is an historical example. Look at a second historical example, and this is streetcars in the Twin Cities. In the Twin Cities, there was a horse car system like in many cities that started to be deployed in the 1870s. Twin Cities were really founded in the 1850s, and technologies followed what was going on in the rest of the country. Streetcars were first deployed, electric streetcars were first deployed in Richmond, Virginia in the late 1880s and quickly adopted. And so the dots here are indications of horse car facilities, and the lines are the construction of the electric streetcar lines. And horse car facilities obviously became electric streetcar sheds over time. And you can see the system is growing, connecting downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul up until the 1950s, when the owners, the private sector owners of the Twin Cities streetcar system, not General Motors, and we want to talk about the General Motors conspiracy as a later question, I'll be happy to talk about that, but not due to that at all. But the owners of the Twin Cities streetcar system converted over to buses, and we're proud of having the fastest conversion of a streetcar system to a motor bus system anywhere in the United States. And as you can see how quickly that system was pulled up. There's an article in Collier's magazine which has a picture of the proprietor of the streetcar system with an old wooden streetcar on fire in the background, and him, looking rich and smiling. So that's the context of what happened in this. But the system in the Twin Cities is a little bit different because the real estate interests that owned the streetcars at the time they were being deployed, this is not in the later period. By the 1940s, they were sold off to the guys who set it on fire. But prior to that, it had largely been owned by land developers. And this map here shows the streetcar lines in blue, and every gray dot is a residential, a single-family home or a multifamily home in the Twin Cities. And we can see this in 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930. Go back and show that again. The question is, did the same processes that occurred in London occur in the Twin Cities? The ownership structure is different because in London only the Metropolitan Railway was allowed to be a land developer. The others, they had cross interests, but it was not as direct. And of course, the land use constraints are different. The Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul are a fast-growing area, but nowhere near as fast-growing as London, and certainly starting from a much smaller base. And so you're starting from a city of essentially no importance in 1850 to a city that by 1920 was one of the top 10 U.S. cities, metropolitan areas at the time. I mean, currently now it's in the high teens, but at the time it was significant enough to get a Federal Reserve Bank branch. There's only 12 Federal Reserve Bank branches, so it was significant at the time. And so we see some of the streetcars being built before there's much density, but the people who were building the streetcars also owned all the land and were selling off the single-family, selling those off for single-family homes. So we built a statistical model, and this is work that I did with Feng Shi, who did this as part of his doctoral dissertation. And so the question is, does the addition of a streetcar line Granger cause the increase in residential density? And so we can look at the change in the density of streetcar lines to try to predict the change in residential density, and it's statistically significant. So that supports the first hypothesis. The second question is trying to predict the streetcar density. And does the increase in residential density lead to addition of streetcar lines? And here, the answer is different. And here, the answer is no, and it's statistically insignificant. So the extension of streetcars outside of downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul preceded residential development. The reverse did not hold. And the answers are due to the ownership structure, that developers were building streetcars to serve speculative land development. There was nobody who was in the business of streetcars for the sake of streetcars themselves, responding to suburbanization elsewhere by providing transportation. So streetcars, loss leader might be too strong a term, but in a sense were a loss leader to help sell single-family homes. And so there's a lot of policy implications that we can learn from looking at these historical models, London, of the Twin Cities, and these types of models are replicated in lots of cities. But we can observe in the US that in general transportation creates access. Now we can talk about how much access, and certainly the access in the 1870s is a different kind of access than today, and it may have been more important. The marginal returns on transportation investment certainly changes over time, but the general process remains. And that access creates value. People want to build in places where they can get to things that they care about. So what do people care about? That's an empirical question. How much access it creates is something we can measure. And because property is privately held in the US, the landowners receive the value that the access is creating. But we see a transportation funding shortfall, and people complain about this all the time. We need to make more investments in transportation, more capital investments. Okay? We haven't been investing nearly as much as we were 50 years ago. The rate of return is lower because the investments, of course, 50 years ago were really important, but there are still a set of investments today that we could make if we had more resources that we're not making because we don't have enough money. And because we're not investing, landowners are receiving less value than they otherwise would. And so this is a problem of closing a feedback loop, where transportation would still create access. That access would still create value. The landowners would still receive value. But some of that value would be captured by the infrastructure funding organization to fund transportation, which is the model that was used in the Twin Cities when the streetcars were first built. The value was captured by the developer of the land and the streetcars together, saying, I'm going to sell off this land and use those proceeds to help pay back the cost of building the streetcars in the first place. And the fares will pay for the operating costs. And that works really well until you need to make the next capital investment, because then you've already developed the land, and there's no obvious way to recover the cost for the second generation of capital. But if we could capture this value by the infrastructure funding organization, landowners would then receive more value because we'd be building more infrastructure. It should be a win-win situation. So this value can be used to fund transport, and there's a lot of strategies that are out there, some of which are in place to various extents in various places. Portland uses some of them. Twin Cities uses some of them. But they're not used as widely as they might be. And so there's a number of strategies. Let's start with the land value tax. We currently spend a lot of money for the local level raised via property taxes to fund local streets and roads. It's been estimated that something like 60% of the costs of local roads are paid for out of general fund revenue, and that's usually raised by property taxes. And property taxes are assessed on both buildings and on the land, which means that if you develop your land, you're paying more tax than you would be if you let your land sit idle, which creates a disincentive to developing your land. The idea behind the land value tax is that we would just tax the land component, the value of which is created by its proximity to everything else. And if you invest in the buildings, that would be taxed at a lower rate, or if there's a differential tax rate, or even at zero if you're going to the extreme on this, which would create incentives for a higher density development. This has been used in some places in Pennsylvania. It's theoretically appealing. Obviously, all of these have political challenges. The idea of tax increment financing, which says that if we build this infrastructure and we're creating access, property values will rise over time. We can borrow against the future property taxes to help build the infrastructure. And that's widely used in a number of places, especially Minnesota. Special assessment districts, we build a piece of infrastructure, we create a district around that infrastructure, and we charge a tax for that particular district. Transportation utility fees, which would be more to pay for the operating costs of facilities rather than the capital costs, would basically say that rather than using property taxes to pay for the operations and maintenance of roads, that we can instead charge proportional to use. But it's not a use fee because that would be really difficult to implement, but we'd estimate your use based on the number of trips we estimate will come out of your property, or the vehicle miles that we estimate would come out of your property. So if you have a 3-story building, we can calculate a trip rate, and that would be the base over which taxes would be assessed. We can look at impact fees. Okay, new infrastructure is required by new development, so we charge some amount of money on new development in order to pay for new infrastructure. We can do this less formally with negotiated exactions. We can look at joint development, and this is used widely in some places, Asia especially, where the jointness is in terms of the jointness of the land use and transportation being developed simultaneously, jointness in that they're being developed adjacent or on top of each other, and jointness that they're being built by either the same organization or two organizations in partnership. And finally, air rights, where we have this existing accessibility that's created, which may be very high above a transit station or above a highway, and that we use the real estate above those facilities in order to capture value. And these each have a set of attributes. Who is the contributor? Is it the property owner? Is it the developer? Is it coordinated by the taxing authority? Is there a partnership, a negotiation involved? Does the timing occur before the transportation improvement or after the transportation improvement? Is it referring to on-site facilities? Okay, that is transportation facilities that are on the site of the development, or off-site facilities, or is it cover the entire jurisdiction? Is the basis only on new development or on existing development? Does it cover upfront or capital costs or ongoing costs? And does this apply when transportation ownership is public or when the transportation ownership is private? So with that, there's just several papers that you can look at which have the details of the models that I talked about, and I will take questions. Thank you.
Before we do questions, just a reminder to please use the microphone on your table or the one that I'm holding in my hand. And to the online registered students, please email the question to me. With that, are there questions?
Forgive me if you already answered this. I'm just curious, was the percentage of fares compared to operating costs similar in like the original rail networks in early London compared to like a modern rail network today?
Oh, in early London, the underground system was profitable. The surface railway system was profitable, which means that the fares covered not only the 100% of the operating costs, but also the debt service or some fraction of the capital costs as well. And the Metropolitan Railway was the most profitable of the London lines. It was the first one. They chose the best line first. And that was paying dividends to stockholders for like 50 years before it was eventually taken over by the municipality. But when it was taken over by the municipality, it was still profitable. It was just taken over for political reasons. The Labor government had come to power, and there was the belief that transportation should be managed centrally and coordinated in the 1930s. But it was still a profitable enterprise at the time. Twin Cities streetcar lines were profitable for many years through the 1940s, with the great decline in U.S. transit in transit usage in the post-war period. It saw some of the same problems, and by the early 1950s, it was having trouble being profitable. They didn't want to make the new investment in having to rebuild the lines because, I mean, from the 1880s to the 1950s was a period of about 70 years, so the capital stock had to be refreshed. They didn't want to make that investment. It was cheaper to buy buses and run those over roads that somebody else was paying for. The buses, I think, were sort of hit or miss on profitability for a few years, and then were generally unprofitable, and the Twin Cities was taken over by the municipal government in 1969 by Metropolitan Planning, what's essentially the sister organization of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, Metro Transit.
An online question, did you want to comment on the impact of highway development?
The process behind highway development is very similar in terms of the positive feedback relationships. But highways have, in the 20th century, been almost entirely a public endeavor in the U.S. and in the U.K. And so you don't have the joint development opportunities that occurred, for instance, with the Twin Cities streetcar lines. So they were municipally provided or provided by state governments or ultimately with federal funding in the U.S. But they had a similar positive relationship to development and have probably a greater value capture problem than the transit lines do, because it's not as easy to do joint development on highways as it is with transit lines.
I'm just wondering if you found any historical evidence of a relationship between travel time and use of this transit?
Not as part of this study. There's a lot of discussion about travel time budgets, and I've done some work in that area. And historically, you can sort of see a rough relationship to travel time budgets in the spatial expansion of London associated with the faster times associated with the rail lines. So if everybody's living in the city of London and walking a quarter mile to a half mile to work, you can estimate what the pedestrian travel time must be. As it moves out, people could, in the same amount of time, travel a much farther distance. Whether that's strictly speaking a travel time budget phenomenon, I think it's harder to assess, because the people today in London are probably spending more time commuting on transit on average than they were in 1801 or 1851. But on the other hand, sitting on a train versus walking, there's a different amount of effort involved. So what exactly should be constant over time isn't clear. But there's some other studies that have looked at that and have argued very strongly for a travel time budget, and others who argue sort of weakly for one. But it's not crystal clear as to what the result of that is.
Do you think the negative relationship between the core residential density and the rail is more the result of the relative attractiveness of the periphery because of the rail connections, or are there other factors like displacement from?
Well, there's two things going on. I mean, the periphery becomes more attractive, so that's an attraction factor. The core becomes more attractive to employment, so there's also this push out as commercial properties are bidding up, or commercial uses are bidding up the rents of what had previously been residential land, making it more expensive to rent there. And so the remarkable change in London from being having the densest residential areas in the world, to having I think it was by 1950, it had the least dense nighttime residence population anywhere in London, and the lowest population density of London. There were only a few hundred people actually living within the borough that defines the city of London by the 1950s. Now it's moved up. There's been some urban renewal in the subsequent decades, so it's a few thousand people now, but it's nowhere near the 50,000 people that it was in 1801. But there's both push and pull factors going on there, and I don't think we have enough data to determine what the strength of the push is versus what the pull is, but that would be a really interesting research project.
With respect to like modern transit and how it's subsidized, does that affect how the positive feedback loop and how like accessibility and demand?
Well, I mean, if the system is subsidized, that means the public is providing more accessibility by that mode than the market would have provided or than the market might be demanding, is sort of the implication of that subsidy. And so if the market is only, is willing to pay X amount of money collectively for this much accessibility, but the public provides that accessibility but at a higher price because the market isn't providing it, obviously. There might be more accessibility than is warranted, which means that there's some resource costs and that money could have been spent on something else. Could have been spent on something else in transportation that might have been more valuable, or it could have been spent on something else like schools or jails or whatever project that you can think of that might be a good use of public funds. And so whether that is socially a good thing, I mean, it's sort of hard to say because there's a lot of spillover effects and externalities as well that are really hard to quantify. And you can argue about, particularly about, you need to provide, there's network effects, so if you provide the infrastructure now, over the long term, it'll grow over time. But if the subsidy is in providing the system and you're creating private land value, but you're not capturing any of the land value, okay, that land value might have been enough to pay for the system. It's just not actually paying for it because it's still held by the private sector, whereas everybody's taxes are paying for that infrastructure. It might be socially a good thing, but it might not be the best way to implement it because you're not tying the beneficiaries to the people who are paying for it.
How can we take social or political stability, how can we take it into account of this growth on transportation? For example, imagine we build something, we build a transportation infrastructure, but because of instability, no one wants to live there. Or
so you build it into a bad neighborhood, let's say?
Yeah. Maybe a wrong
Yeah, so
decision.
one of the things that people want access to is access to peace and quiet and safety, right? So even if you provide access to jobs, if you're providing them access to danger as well, that's not going to be necessarily enough to offset it. And so if I'm willing to pay more to be in a safer neighborhood, okay, I'm paying for something, and I'm paying for the access to security. The access to jobs, the access to other things might not be enough to make up for that. If you've got other social problems, transportation is probably the last place you want to be investing in order to solve those particular problems. There's a lot better, more direct ways to be dealing with social problems than putting in a new line to try to turn around a neighborhood. Now, it might help, but whether that's the most cost-effective way of attacking that problem, I think, is something that depends on the case. But
You mean, have you seen any negative rate of population growth despite a positive rate of transportation?
oh, sure.
And was it because of something like this?
Well, there's anecdotal stories. I mean, sort of similar, perhaps along the similar lines. Some of the rail systems that have been built have been opposed because people are afraid of who will be brought into their neighborhood, right? So you're connecting the central city to a suburban area, and people who live in the suburban area don't want to have access to the central city. They want to be far from the central city. That's why they moved to the suburbs in the first place. And there's some empirical evidence about crime rates and perceived crime rates affecting land values in those areas around stations. Now, in some areas it works fine and that isn't a problem. In other areas there are cases where it's certainly perceived to be a problem. So the trying to provide access of suburban residents to get to the center city faster allows people who live in the center city to get access to the suburbs faster, which sort of in an ideal world would be great, but some people who move to the suburbs might not believe that's a great outcome because they left the center city for a reason, and for whatever reason, whether you approve of those reasons or don't approve of those reasons, they did leave for those reasons. They might not appreciate it. And there's cases of a number of shopping centers that, after the construction of rail lines, to them have seen significant downfalls in sales value and things like that, that people anecdotally will associate with the rail line, either because of the realities or because of the perceptions of what's going on there. And so people will behave in different ways. Trying to solve social problems with transportation is probably not, again, not what you want to be doing. You want to be moving people. There's enough transportation problems to solve with transportation before trying to invest to solve the rest of the problems of the world.
I think with that, we will, in a minute, we'll thank our speaker. But I want to mention that next Friday at noon, Scott Samuelson, the director of the National Fuel Cell Research Center at UC Irvine, will be our speaker here. And with that, let's thank David Levinson for his presentation. Did all the students sign in?
Thanks.